In this video, I'm going to show how to blend two images together in Photoshop to create one balanced exposure on a landscape. So I'm going to open two files. They'll first open in Camera Raw, obviously because they're raw images. This is the lighter of the two images, and I'm going to darken the sky down in this one, even though this is a light image, and I'm mainly going to be using this just for the beach and the sea and the foreground. I still want to darken the sky down just so it makes it easy to blend the two images together in Photoshop. If I left this extremely bright as it is at the moment, it would make the line where I blend the two images together much harder to conceal later. So I've picked my neutral density, my graduated neutral density filter, and I've drawn it out over about half the image, and I'm going to turn the exposure down maybe about a stop or a stop and maybe a stop and a half, so that it brings it back into manageable highlights. So you can see that my reds have gone away now, which indicate that I'm no longer clipping the highlights. The only other thing that I will do in Camera Raw is make sure that the lens profile and the chromatic aberration boxes are ticked. So they are, so I'm going to open that one now. You can obviously use a graduated neutral density filter when you're taking the picture. This is just an alternative software version of doing it. Both have their pluses and minuses, and their merits and the demerits. Sometimes Photoshop is a little bit more flexible when using this, although if you use a filter when you're taking it, then obviously that saves you time editing later. I'm going to open the second image. Which is the darker one. All I'm going to do with this one is just make sure that the two lens correction boxes are ticked, which they are. I'm going to open that one. Okay, so now I've got the darker one open, I'm going to select all of it, and then I'm going to go to Edit and Copy, and then over to the tab with a lighter image and Edit and Paste. So now in this workspace I have two layers, both aligned. So on the darker layer I'm going to add a layer mask, and then I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to go Command or Control I to invert the layer mask. So at the moment it now goes invisible, and I'm doing it this way around because it's a smaller area. It's just the sky that I'm going to have to blend together. So I just need my paintbrush with a white foreground colour, and I'm going to gradually start painting in the darker image on the layer mask so that it shows through onto the lighter image. I've got my brush set to an opacity of 10%, therefore I can build up the density in the sky gradually. Just zoom in there a bit to see what I'm doing a bit more easily, and I can paint it over the sky and gradually decide how much density I want in here. Obviously this right hand side is a little bit on the brighter side than the rest of it, so I think a little bit more concentration on that area with the brush, and the rest of it is probably needed. You can probably also see that I'm going over the horizon slightly with my brush, and if I'd have left the original light exposure very light, this would have created all sorts of problems with blending the two together. So this is why I darkened it down a bit to start with, so that this actual line between the two isn't quite as obvious. So I think I'm getting there now. I'm just going to add a few little extra brush strokes along the top. And maybe even go slightly less on the opacity, down to about 5%, just to add a couple of strokes over the horizon, just so that we can blend that in a little bit. And there's no sort of terrible, harsh intersection between the two images. Okay, that's looking reasonably good, I think. So now what I want to do is add onto this layer 1 a levels adjustment layer. And that means I can just tweak the contrast a bit, so pull down the shadows, a bit more drama, and then push up the whites and the highlights. As long as you don't go past the start of the curve here on the histogram, you know that you're not going to be losing any detail in the highlights or the shadows. The blank areas at either end of the histogram curve are just areas free of information, sort of digital information, so you can't, it makes it darker obviously, but you're not blocking up the shadows and you're not burning out the highlights by just going over these areas. So I'm just really working it backwards and forwards to see where I really prefer the darknesses and the highlights here. I think round about there is where I want it. I'll close that down. Okay, what I'm going to do next is go to Stamp Visible so I can add a filter on top. So Stamp Visible is just a combination of Layer, Merge Visible, and the Alt key. And if you press the Alt key and Merge Visible, you get a new layer on top, which kind of combines all the layers underneath it, so you can add a filter without having to flatten the whole thing. So the filter I want to use is the Camera Raw filter. And with this image, I feel the whole thing is just a little bit on the sort of browny, murky side, and what I have practiced earlier is turning down the temperature of this image and making it more on the cooler side, which I really think helps. So if I turn it down to minus sort of 20 or 15 on the temperature balance, I much prefer the look of that. It gives you a much more sort of early morning feel. What I'm also going to do is tweak up the whites a little bit to make the whites stand out. And obviously the great thing about being in Camera Raw is that as soon as you start losing detail in the whites, it shows you with the red highlight warning. I'm just going to take it back a bit just to make sure there's still plenty of information left in the whites. Then with the blacks, I'm going to just turn those down a bit, just not going mad so the corners vignette too much, but just a bit more to add a little bit of extra contrast. Okay, I'm going to finish that by clicking OK. The eagle-eyed amongst you will have realised that this picture has a few spots on it from my dirty camera sensor, so I'm just going to end by cloning those blemishes out. So I'm going to go to my spot healing tool and just shrink that brush down a little bit and just click on that dust on the camera sensor there, and there's one other patch that I want to work on over here. It's just this little bit of beach where the sea hasn't quite washed over that bit of beach as much as I would have wanted it to, and I think it just catches your eye on the right hand side here. So again, I'm going to try it with my spot healing brush just to make that look a bit more homogeneous. See how that works. So I'm just going to shrink that down a bit. That's not bad. That's not bad. I'm just going to play there a bit. Yeah, I think that's pretty good. It hides that darker piece of beach, and I think that's looking quite decent now. So basically, what I did was I had two exposures of the same image, one for the foreground and one for the sky. I imported them both into Camera Raw, made a few slight adjustments, then brought them both into Photoshop. I selected one, copied it, and then pasted it over the top of the other. I created a layer mask so I could paint through detail from one layer onto the top of the other layer. And I blended those together with a very soft brush, which was set at a low opacity, so I could combine the two stroke by stroke with the brush tool. I created a levels adjustment layer just to give the image a little bit more contrast. And then I created a stamp visible layer so I could add a Camera Raw filter over the top of the whole stack of layers, and I could tweak the colour balance. I much preferred this image when it was looking cooler, so I turned down the colour temperature a bit towards the cooler, bluer end of the spectrum. And I finished off with getting rid of some dust and a little bit of a darker patch of beach which was catching my eye. And this is more like the image that I envisaged when I was there taking it.